Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick, the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and the author of the Cutting Through newsletter on Substack. Today, I am really honored and excited to be able to talk to Daniel Levy, the president of the U.S. Middle East Project. From 2012 to 2016, Daniel was director for the Middle East and North Africa at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow and director of the New America Foundation's Middle East Task Force in Washington and a senior fellow at the Century Foundation in New York. He was a senior advisor in the Israeli Prime Minister's office and to Justice Minister Yossi Beilin during the government of Ehud Barak from 1999 to 2001. Levy is a founder and advisory board member of the Diaspora Alliance, council member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and serves on the board of the European Middle East Project. He frequently writes for, is interviewed by, and quoted in multiple media outlets, and has been published in the New York Times, Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, amongst many others. Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today. I'm really honored to have you.
Mitchell, it is very nice to have the opportunity to catch up with you again.
Great to see you. So let's jump right into it. The ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, which took effect on January 19th, it's divided into three phases. The first phase is supposed to last 6 weeks. Do you see it lasting that long? And if so, do you see it getting to actually to phase two and beyond and really being implemented?
As we're talking, we are in the second week. There has been in large measure, implementation as planned. And it's also very clear just what a bumpy road this is going to be. So I think what are the headlines at the moment in terms of implementation? Obviously, the daily mass killing events of Palestinians, the daily destruction, everything's destroyed, but the continuation of those bombings has stopped. You've had, as we speak, and that number will increase shortly, you've had 7 of the Israelis held in Gaza come out. You have had what should never have been an issue. Let's be very clear. It should never have taken a deal for this to happen, but you have had, finally, the humanitarian aid and assistance going in. Mm-hmm. Israel's prevention of that is one of the reasons that the Prime Minister and former Secretary of Defense of Israel, Gallant, and Netanyahu both have International Criminal Court arrest warrants issued against them for starvation as a war crime. And you've had these very dramatic scenes in the last days of Palestinians returning to the north of Gaza. On the one hand, a demonstration of remarkable fortitude and resilience on the part of those people, and also heart-rending scenes of what they're returning to. But you've also had the collapse, near collapse, and certainly the beginning of the unraveling of Netanyahu's coalition, right? So one faction has left, Ben Gvir's Jewish Power, and said, we'll only go back if you resume the total victory, parenthetical, not actually a thing that can be achieved, onslaught on Gaza. You've had Smotrich's religious Zionism faction saying, we'll stay, but only if we see you go back to war. So life is rarely this transparent when people say, give us war and you can have your coalition. So those are the headlines, and the two other crucial things are you haven't had Netanyahu and those around him basically denying the terms of the agreement by saying, A, we're going to return to the military assault, which is explicitly against what he has agreed. The details of stage 2 and 3 aren't worked out, but stage 2 and 3 is the permanent ceasefire, the full withdrawal. So he is violating not just the spirit, but he's violating what he's agreed to. He's denying having agreed to that. And of course, you have the X factor, which got us to this moment, let's make no mistake, which is Trump. But where does he go from here? Therefore, it is not only going to be fragile up until the end of phase 1, but the possibility of seeing the implementation, the fulfillment of the latter phases looks like a significant stretch of the three scenarios. Full implementation, Israel actually adhering to what it has agreed to, Israel being prevented from returning to the daily committing of war crimes in Gaza. Of the three scenarios, that one, the second one being a return to a full onslaught, the end of the agreement either before the end of phase one or in the transition from phase one to not seeing phase two. And the third scenario being something a bit in between, right? Where some military operations are resumed. There's not the formal collapsing. Israel gets far more aggressive in conditioning the entry of humanitarian assistance. You don't see the release of further Israelis. That in-between state is perhaps the more likely, and sadly the least likely, is that this deal gets seen through to completion.
You mentioned, it's interesting, you mentioned how rare it is to see this sort of transparency where you have the choice being put on the table of give us war and we'll let you keep your coalition. I think that contrasts really sharply right now with the Trump administration, where Trump's strategy on many things, not just on this, on pretty much his whole style of governance, is to confuse people, to throw out all sorts of different ideas, to do a lot of different things, to try a lot of different avenues. It of course raises the question whether he has any sort of real policy ideas at all. But to the extent he does, there is no clarity. There's nothing but confusion. Given that, I mean, how do you, and given the fact that more than likely for this to proceed to any, a phase two or even to hold the tenuous ceasefire that we have right now is going to require some action from Washington. I mean, we do see that Steve Witkoff is in Israel again today, apparently to press for the maintenance of this ceasefire. Do you see Trump taking the necessary actions to maintain the ceasefire, let alone to move it forward to the next phases?
I know it feels retro, but are we allowed, Mitchell, to acknowledge how horrible the previous administration's handling of this was?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's do that.
Absolutely.
It's important for the historic record. It's important for anyone who wants to, I would argue, in the US, build an alternative governing platform which speaks to a different approach, a different set of values, a different America, which treats its own voters and constituency with something that is not contempt. So it's important for all of those reasons, but it's also important as a backdrop to what's going on now. And for me, the paradoxical thing is the jaw-dropping weakness and complicity and indulgence of the Biden administration when it came to making this so easy for Netanyahu actually has done some of the, inadvertently, to be very clear, has done some of the work for Trump, because the bar for pressure is actually quite low.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about it. So I don't think that when Trump came in, there was an explicit threat or an explicit promise which led Netanyahu to go to the place he had not gone to and desperately doesn't want to be in. And it's, again, there's great clarity around this. He doesn't want to be in this agreement. He doesn't want the agreement to continue. He wants coalition stability. But I don't think there were threats or promises. I think Netanyahu simply had to recalibrate, recalculate, because he saw a president who, let's be very clear, and we've heard these chilling comments, actually, with regard to relocating the population of Gaza, with regard to Egypt, Jordan, etc. And they've been repeated more than once now, and they're not coming from nowhere. So let's be clear, this isn't an administration that is going to embrace a narrative or a policy which belatedly acknowledges Palestinian rights, that America has been central to the decades-long denial of those rights, or that regional stability, American national interests, and the good of Palestinians and Israelis will be served by an American policy which holds Israel's feet to the fire and dismantles the structures of apartheid and occupation. That's not, okay, like breaking news. That's not what Trump is here to. But what we see is a president who acts like the president of a superpower in his dealings with a dependent, and we see just how dependent Israel is, with a dependent ally, and the leader of that ally, which has that great dependence, isn't sure that he can wrap the superpower around his little finger, as he was very sure with Biden, Blinken, and all those people who we can consign to the dustbin of history, hopefully. And he isn't sure that Netanyahu's narrow personal political interest will always align with the interest of the president. And if those don't align, that Netanyahu come out on top. In fact, his bet is probably that Trump can further upend Netanyahu's domestic politics. And therefore, crucial to the continuation or discontinuation of this ceasefire is whether Netanyahu continues to perceive a greater threat from the outside of things Trump might say and do, upending just this narrow but really important thing of Netanyahu's political calculation versus the domestic threat. We've talked about that, the coalition, and whether Netanyahu can navigate this to a place where he wants. And I certainly wouldn't bet against the latter. I would say that thus far we have seen a Netanyahu, which some of us had forgotten, but which we certainly have lots of history to draw upon, which is a Netanyahu who is easily pressured, easily panicked. We're talking in advance of Trump apparently welcoming Netanyahu as the first foreign leader. Boy, did he work for that, Netanyahu. Yeah. I mean, it almost feels like another lesson in Bibi's desperation and weakness. So these are interesting factors. And at the same time, Trump is, of course, unpredictable. Trump is, of course, surrounded by a Republican ecosystem when it comes to Israel and Palestine that is anything but friendly to anything constructive that can allow for progress. And Trump throws out a lot of things. Some are in order to be negotiated back from a maximalist position. Some will stick, and some will, just be forgotten, and he'll pretend like he never ever said them. And it's also a really good idea. Well, it's a really good idea to read Stephen Walt's piece that we might already have hit peak Trump, if I can recommend that to people. And in it, Stephen Walt reminds us, are you enjoying the wall that was built with Mexican money? Did he get a grip on America's trade deficit? The many, many things. And so let's take a deep breath also when it comes to the things Trump is saying.
That I couldn't agree more. I recently wrote something about but something to the effect of what people were talking about, the Trump effect when the ceasefire came into being, and I said this is not a Trump effect; it's a POTUS effect. It's simply Trump using the tools that Biden always had at his disposal and refused to use. And I couldn't agree more with your read on Netanyahu here. But I guess I want to dive just a little bit deeper into what you mentioned about who's surrounding Trump. We know the people that Mike Huckabee, who's completely lunatic on this, comes from the deep heart of John Hagee and Christian Zionism. Elise Stefanik at the UN talking about Israel's biblical rights to the West Bank. And even ones who are, you know, and of course, Pete Hegseth, who's a complete lunatic, even ones who are a little more grounded, like Marco Rubio, who I think is a little bit more traditionally right wing, if we can put it that way, is very hawkish on this issue. On the other hand, you know, Trump is going to be influenced by players in the region. He's very interested in what Qatar has to say. His family is doing a lot of business with Qatar. He's very interested, obviously, in what the Saudis have to say. He's clearly going to prioritize, if not, he'll double down now because Biden failed to conclude a normalization agreement despite trying so hard. He'll want even more to succeed where Biden failed. Who, you know, when those different things are competing in Trump's mind, where do you see policy sort of falling? Do you think he'll listen more? I mean, I have my suspicions. Do you think he'll listen more to the players in the region or the people around him in Washington?
So it's not our first rodeo with this president. We actually have a track record to look back on. We have that cast of characters. We know that there is a broader ecosystem in the contemporary GOP world, whether that is the dispensationalist, evangelical, Greater Israel, Zionist crowd, whether it's some of the donor community, whether it's some of those who in very vicious ways have gone after civil liberties inside the US, especially in the last 16 months, around some of the protests, the congressional caucus. So we're familiar with all of those things, and therefore the smart money is probably on this landing in a place which is, on the one hand, very damaging to the prospects of a Palestinian future looking any better. As you know, I would add to that if Palestinians never see justice and freedom and rights, then Israelis will never see security either. So, we have to just acknowledge that. At the same time, when it comes to that bigger picture, it also, I am not going to have much patience for Democrats who come and plead, oh, isn't this also terrible what he's doing, if they are not working day and night diligently. Those who were part of an administration complicit in genocide, renting sackcloth upon their flesh, and those who weren't working day and night to change the fundamental nature of their party. And in that respect, I actually think, again, there is a clarity that is useful because the US is very unlikely to be the driver of a better future, peace, justice, the dismantling of those structures of apartheid and occupation for the interests of Palestinians and Israelis. We are going to have to look elsewhere. The US will be a latecomer. The US tried to prop up the South African apartheid regime till very, very late in the day. There are civil movements, there are global South actors, there's a shifting geopolitics, and I think that is where a lot of attention should be. But if I come back to this narrow question of the Trump administration, I do think it's more interesting than the cardboard cutout evil portrayal. And I think it's more interesting because this second Trump administration has continuity to it, but also has a different feel to it. And I'm certainly not the only one who looks at this and says, there are competing camps. I think the easiest terminology I would use when it comes to national security foreign policy is that you have represented in that milieu, in positions of office, you have neoconservatives, hawkish warmongers, And you have alongside that, opposite to that, restraints. And I think that's the correct language to use. And I give credit to people at the Quincy Institute and elsewhere who I think have familiarized people with that language. You see that in the DoD. You see the National Security Council looks quite neoconservative. You see the milieu around the vice president is much more likely to be a restrainer. Yeah. Some of the tech bro world is going to go in both directions, but some of it is also going to be more in this restrainer mold. And there are things that this administration will want to do, not least on the economy, which is always going to be first and foremost in everyone's mind, which do not align with a more aggressive posture in the Middle East, being sucked into conflict, which Israel often wants them to be sucked into. I think it's easier to see those fault lines on the question of Iran, for instance. I fear that when it comes to the daily grind and minutiae and granularity of how Palestinians are mistreated, it's less easy to see those divisions, and there'll be less of a camp saying, oh, no, we can't let that happen in the West Bank or in Jerusalem or at Al-Aqsa, okay? But there will be moments, and maybe getting the hostages, including Americans, out, and maybe not having a return to the calamities of the onslaught against Gaza is one of those. We'll duke it out a bit, and where we'll have to see those things. The other thing I would say is, I don't think any of us should make light of the fact that you have folks like Stefanik, Huckabee, and some of these folks in the National Security Council and elsewhere. And when that then translates into the use of language, like we've seen from the president, regarding depopulating Gaza, regarding Jordan and Egypt taking the Palestinians of Gaza in, personally, I don't think that's something that Trump can make happen. I don't think it's a priority for him. I don't see how you can make the argument that this is what serves the American national interest. I think it's much easier to make the counter argument. But the reason these things are so problematic is because of the environment in Israel into which they're being introduced. It helps further fuel a permissive environment around genocidal intent, the intent to ethnically cleanse, the intent to remove the Palestinian population on the part of significant cohorts of the Israeli body politic, and filtered down into media, into culture, increasingly into people in the military. So that's why I don't make light of it.
I agree. I think on the one hand, I think it would take a lot. I don't think it's impossible for Trump to necessarily put so much pressure on Egypt and Jordan and make such threats to them that they would have to cave in eventually. But the price there would be so high. They would go, I think, a very long distance. I think Egypt and Jordan would both threaten to pull out of their peace treaties with Israel. I think, the price would be very, very high. I don't see Trump. I agree with you. I don't see Trump expending this kind of effort and capital to make that happen. But then
let's add to that, Mitchell. Let's just add to that. Who's going to make it happen? Who's going to load these people?
Exactly. That was precisely something I'm about to publish on that very point.
And look at the region. Look at what the imagery, the media that people across the region have been consuming on a daily basis, not because they have bloodthirsty, warmongering media, but actually because they're accessing media which is telling a lot more of the truth than the appalling job most of the Western media has done in terms of what's going on in Gaza. So this is, and it plays into how free the Saudi leadership is to do whatever they want at any given moment. Now, I don't underestimate their ability to make sure that whatever they decide works. But I also don't underestimate the significant pull factors in the other direction and just how counterproductive and destabilizing any such effort would be, especially from that opening point.
Right.
Look at those people returning to the north. These are people who know what it means to be separated from their land. These are people who are not going to be easily separated from their land again. I'm also not saying, I agree with you, I'm not saying I don't see any scenario in which this can happen. But Israel has defeated neither the armed resistance, very clear, and you're not going to be able to get in a deal signed by Washington with Cairo and Amman, as unlikely as that seems anyway, or a deal that Israel and the Americans think they can put together, what you couldn't get in months and months of horrific bombing. So the armed resistance has stood on its feet, and the people, which sometimes aligns, but it's also something different, the resilience of the people. You put all that together, and then you throw into the mix what I should have mentioned when kind of looking at that restrainer neoconservative. It speaks also to a tension between MAGA and MIGA, make America great again and make Israel great again. And there are people, and for some, I imagine it comes from an anti-Semitic animus. For most, I don't think it has to. I think many of those people do not like to see an America led by the nose by a foreign country that wants America to do things that are conspicuously not in America's interest. It's a country that depends on America, and it should be, at least in significant measure, dealt with as such. The fact that the Democrats rolled over and were so pathetic doesn't mean that this is a happy place for many people.
Yeah. So I've got two more questions for you. One is sticking with this regional issues, and one is more about Israeli politics. Regionally speaking, I think Biden, and I would disagree with this, but I think Biden would argue that his support for Israel's actions since October the 7th, 2023, ended up, he would of course not want to look at Gaza, but he would say regionally it strengthened Israel's position vis-a-vis Iran, obviously dealt severe blows to Hezbollah and hurt Hamas, although not nearly as much as one would think given the resources that were thrown against them, but certainly set Iran's regional ambitions back. I think that would be the argument. First of all, would you agree with that assessment? And second of all, either way, do you feel like the United States is looking at that and the engagers, as we say, are looking to push that forward and really press? I have some really deep concerns about where this administration is going to go vis-a-vis Iran. And I think Israel is going to be at the center of that strategy. So what are your thoughts?
Right. And so starting at that place, and I would go along with what you say and add to that. I think there are two things that Netanyahu really is testing and prodding, and that's part of the urgency of coming to Washington. It's also a show for back home. One is, how much wiggle room does he have on Gaza? And the second is, where's the lay of the land on Iran? What are his options on that? How amenable to being pulled into this are the new administration? I think that is a very palpable danger. I think if you are looking at an economy that could hit serious inflationary, a resumption of inflation, if you're serious about the kind of clampdowns on a migrant labor force that you seem to be undertaking, and if you're serious about tariffs and what that could do to your overall economic management, then the last thing you want is a major military conflagration and the effect that will have on energy prices, which Trump has said you've got to bring those down. So again, I want to point out that there are countervailing forces at work here that we should be aware of. That bigger regional question and what was the legacy of Biden and their claim to have made Israel stronger vis-a-vis the axis of resistance, I think it starts from at least a couple and probably many misplaced premises in terms of what what is the goal of the axis of resistance in the first place? How does that sit with the rest of the region? So if we look at it, yeah, the blow to Hezbollah is undoubted, but even that, don't exaggerate. The idea that you can now go back and dust off those plans for remaking the region in the image of an Israeli hegemon, everything revolves around that hegemon, an Abraham Accords on steroids. I would argue that even the fall of Assad is really interesting in terms of what it does. Who are the people who are now going to be running Syria? Is there some kind of impetus given to a second wave of attempts to have a region that is more answerable to its people? And in that respect, I think in historical terms, the fallout from what has been done and what was supported by the Biden administration at the moment, and this is likely to be intensified, looks much more to center around how Israel's actions, the scale of what was done, what was broadcast, the self-incrimination, the things that have been said, is making Israel a much harder to absorb entity in the region. I actually think this is a real problem. This is something I talk to my Israeli friends about. This is not normal. It's not okay. This is terrible for your long-term safety and security. Do you know what you are doing with the things that you are saying? And that no one seizes the mantle of actually holding out an alternative. None of these pathetic opposition leaders. The fact that not one Zionist member of Knesset raised their hand against closing down UNRWA. The fact that not one Zionist member of Knesset raised their hand to say, yes, a Palestinian state is still an option. So I think what Israel has done is actually to dramatically weaken itself. It's created a whole new set of vulnerabilities, a whole new world of recruitment potential for those who will want to take up arms against it. It has shown itself to be a destabilizing factor. And that's true for those in the Gulf as well. Those in the Gulf who want to move forward and say, our plans are, even if the Trump administration isn't interested in transitioning to a global economy that will be less predicated on oil, we know that's coming. We want to build for our future. And Iran isn't the most destabilizing factor. Israel is. Israel is bombing Arab capitals as if it had gone out of fashion. So you have the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement. Therefore, I think, as with virtually everything else when it comes to the Middle East and probably foreign policy writ large, the Biden people could not be more wrong.
I couldn't agree with you more. So I want to close on a question about Israeli politics. We when we're talking about Gaza and all of the so-called war, it's a really bad word to use for it, but that Netanyahu has engaged in for the past 15 months, there's always a sort of competition. How much of this is a sort of Israeli foreign policy pursuit? How much of this has to do with Netanyahu's own self-interest in terms of his political and legal troubles? So you have, now a government that's a coalition that's hanging on by a thread. And recent polling that I've seen suggests that if they do go to elections, this government will not win, although it would still be difficult for the opposition, especially since they won't work with Hadash and Tal, to put together their own government. So we'd have all of that drama, but the current government is definitely lagging well behind. And yet, Bezalel Smotrich, it has no problem threatening to leave the government, even though that would likely put him much farther away from power in the end. Shas now, I think, maybe more importantly, is threatening to bolt if the Haredi draft exemption law is not passed within 2 months. Aryeh Deri has been known to enjoy bringing down governments in the past. So do you believe that this government could actually fall within the next month or 2 or 3 months maybe? And if so, is there any reason to believe that an opposition government could pursue a different policy. My sense is that Benny Gantz or whoever would lead such an opposition is not Yair Lapid. They're not likely to change the foreign policies that we're seeing Netanyahu pursue. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so one, Netanyahu very much sought to reinvent himself as a wartime leader. And it's worked quite well for him, okay? 7th of October, staggering failure of first response, of preparation, of course, the hubris that preceded it, etc. And right now, it doesn't feel like he's in control of the narrative on Gaza in terms of what we're seeing. But the regional stuff plays to his advantage. He can make these claims that if I had conceded and agreed to a deal earlier, we wouldn't have done what we did with Hezbollah, we wouldn't have got Yahya Sinwar, etc., etc. So war has been his flak jacket. It's held his coalition together. It's kept the public from going back to normal politics, debating the things where his coalition, to a majority of Israelis, Jewish Israelis, falls short. It's kept the who's answerable for October 7th on the back burner. So it does feel like his management of politics becomes far more challenging, hard to sustain if he is not running a war, which is one of the reasons why we have a multi-front war. Israel is still in Lebanon. Israel has just committed itself to staying in Syria beyond the already illegally annexed Golan Heights. Israel is conducting a major operation in the West Bank. It just said it will not leave Jenin, and that operation is not limited Jenin. It is provoking things. So that's one piece of this. I think Netanyahu really does not want to go to elections, as you have said. There is no poll which shows him winning. I think his fallback options, if he can't hold his coalition together, are to rely on a safety net from the center. He doesn't want to do that because he knows those people will be waiting to kick him out, as well they should. I think if he's forced into an election, he might hope that the election has an outcome which can't see the formation of a new government. And in that respect, he has worked hard and effectively and probably successfully in returning Israel to a place where no party that is not Zionist, no party that represents the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel will be admissible into a coalition formation. That's his way of trying to make it hard for the other side. So he is going to try to hold on. Right now, as we're speaking, and you mentioned some of this, Mitchell, where things are looking more dicey for him by the day. This unfinished business of the enlistment of the Haredim, the enlistment of the ultra-Orthodox, without which Darius said they won't stay in, there's no reason for them to stay in. This clash between the religious Zionists, who not only serve, but serve very enthusiastically, have been posting so many of these horrendous genocidal peons on social media, and who have taken more losses than the population at large, okay? Their patience with the idea that the Haredi don't enlist, this is becoming a fault line with a depth that most people did not anticipate. So this is becoming really hard to be papered over and to be managed, and throw into that mix that he has to pass a budget within 2 months by the end of March, or according to Israeli regulations, you automatically go to election. I am, for the first time in a long time, calculating that Netanyahu may not make it through. He's in a much more treacherous water than we expected. As for the alternatives, that's an incredibly depressing picture. No one. They'll disagree with him on some things, on many things. Yeah, but if you're pro or anti-Netanyahu, is not an ideological fault line. It's not a governing alternative. No one has owned even the semblance of an outside track of some moral value, normative critique of what has been done, how it's been done. Should it have been done in that way? No one owns anything approaching a realizable human alternative when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and the region. And Naftali Bennett is in pole position. Should he choose to return to politics, to take up that mantle? And Lieberman is a strong player in the opposition. Gantz was in the war cabinet. Lapid is as cavalier about throwing around the misplaced accusations of anti-Semitism and of silencing and criminalizing not only Palestinians, but progressive Jews. So unfortunately, the opposition looks like a horror show. Does it look, are there circumstances, regional, global, domestic, where that can look different in power? Life is always unpredictable, but the starting positions that we go into this with are not encouraging, to say the least.
Yeah, I hate to end on such a down note, but
yeah,
I don't see any other way to end these kinds of conversations. Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time, sharing your wisdom with us. I have to have you back one day so we can talk about your work with the Diaspora Alliance and anti-Semitism, because I think this is going to be the issue, certainly for the Jewish community, for the next 4 years. But again, thank you so much for taking the time. I know how busy you are. Deeply appreciated and always good to talk to you.
And keep up the amazing work, Mitchell. It's really good to be with you and talking with you.
Thank you. So once again, I want to thank Daniel Levy, and I hope you all enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. If you want to see more of this, please subscribe to my Substack, mitchellplitnick.substack.com, or you can find it on Substack by looking up Cutting Through. That's the name of the newsletter. And if you can become a paid subscriber, it really helps me to continue to bring you this kind of content. You can look back in the archives and see my earlier interview with Matt Duss. I have numerous other ones lined up potentially to do over the next few months. And I think you'll find them all really interesting and rewarding. If you can subscribe, become a paid subscriber, please do so. It really, really helps keep this going. Even if you can't, just subscribing and sharing with your friends is also a really big help. It's going to be a rough 4 years, folks, not only in Gaza, not only in Israel and Palestine, but also here in the United States. And it's going to be really rough for journalism and for information. And this is one source I can promise you will always bring you something to talk about, something based in fact and accuracy. You may not always agree with it, but that's not what any of this should be about. And I promise to keep doing the work as much as I possibly can. And the more support I get from you, the more I can do that. Thank you again, and keep on going.